Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the latest edition of the Fast Forward Expert Roundtable webinar series. Today, we are talking about entry-level driver training requirements for the trucking industry. So as we are joining the event here today, we've got folks logging on right now. We're going to go ahead and start with some introductions. I know some of you have participated in our webinar series before, but some of you may be joining us for the very first time and don't know a whole lot about us. My name is Craig Hart. I'm with Vertical Alliance Group. My background is in distance learning. It's what my life has been since 2004, both within the transportation industry as well as in the financial services and insurance worlds. And my co-host, with the mostest, is Mr. Mark Ray. Mark is like many of you. He is a former trucking executive with over 35 years experience in the field. He worked with Frozen Food Express out of Dallas, Texas. That's a reefer hauler that I know some of you may be familiar with. And even though he has retired from that world, he is now still very active in the industry, both with advising other trucking companies and also government groups and education organizations that are tackling current and future issues that are going to impact our industry, such as the electrification of trucking and school buses, and also different ways to address the driver shortage, expanding CDL training options, and so forth. Mark, it's lovely to see you again today, sir.
Thank you for having me, and I'm really looking forward to today's discussion where we are anticipating this ELDT to go forward in February. I've been involved when the committee was established back, I want to say 5 or 6 years ago. I think it's good for our industry, and we're very fortunate to have Jeremy Rose joining us today, who has thousands of hours invested in developing the content that'll keep you compliant and even above compliance with FMCSA. So if you're not familiar, put on your seatbelt. We got a lot to cover today, and really looking forward to Jeremy's presentation.
Excellent. Now, that brings us a great point. Jeremy Rose is our guest speaker today. Jeremy is one of our internal staffers here at Vertical Alliance Group. His official title is Video Production Manager, but he really oversees all the content that we create and distribute on a monthly basis. Some of you, if you have gone through our training, may even recognize his voice, as he has been the voiceover artist on several of the videos as well. He's been doing this for 14 years, folks. So he knows content. He's been dealing with the ELDT program since it was first announced and delayed multiple times. So I am sure he's very glad that this is finally coming to fruition. And then we also have Woody Odell on the call with us today. Woody is another staffer here at Vertical Alliance Group. Some of you may be familiar with him when he was on our client success team, and now he's over in more of our sales development area. And the reason that we have Woody on the call with us today is we are going to cover a lot of information, and we will have a replay of this available to everyone who has attended today, but you may also want to see it in action. You may want to be able to get your hands on it, and Woody has the ability to do a demo for you. Takes about 20-30 minutes and can walk you through how it's set up in the system, how you assign out training, create templates, and things like that. And so I wanted to include his phone number and his email address on here because that's something that we can actually get scheduled today. And he would love to speak with you. This is something that he does all the time. And we're very glad to have him on the call with us today as well. So Jeremy and Woody, thank you guys for being with us. And the real reason that we are doing this is entry-level driver training. The requirement kicks off in February of 2022. And it really falls smack dab in the middle of the process for a new driver to get their license. So in the past, it was a much more streamlined process. Application, permit, go to a school, and away you go. And now you have this entry-level driver training, which makes it possible for some of you on the line right now who are contemplating becoming your own CDL training providers, the ability to do that now without having to go through a third party. So we want to talk about what those requirements entail. We want to talk about how we are assisting with those requirements on our end as a theory content provider, and also the steps that you can take to become a registered training provider on your own. So excellent. All right, Jeremy. One more thing before we start. This is an interactive session with you all out in TV land. Easiest way to do that is through the chat function. The chat is on your action bar there at the top of the screen. Go ahead and open that up. And then at the bottom, there is a button right now. It probably does not say everyone, but if you click on it, there's a little drop down that says everyone. And that way you can ask us questions as we are going through the information that we're covering today. I know a lot of the questions will be addressed by the content that Jeremy has put together, but there may be other questions as well that you have, maybe specific to our platform and how we can facilitate this kind of training going forward. But we want to hear from you. So go ahead and fire up your chat button. Let us know who you are, where you're calling in from or dialing in from. I see a couple folks already. Good morning, Ash. It's great to see you again. So hadn't seen you in a while, so welcome back. But while you guys are doing that, I'm going to go ahead now and turn the floor over to Jeremy so he can educate us on what we need to know.
All right, thanks very much, Craig. Hello, everyone. My name is Jeremy Rose. I'm the Video Production Manager for Infinit-I Workforce Solutions. And today I'm here to talk to you about entry-level driver training, the new training regulations from the FMCSA. Please note that this presentation is designed for those that have little to no prior knowledge about entry-level driver training, what it is, or why it's important. If you're already familiar with the new regulations, then most of this information will not be new to you, but stick around, we're going to get into some of the nitty-gritty, and there will be a Q&A section for you to ask questions there. There's a lot of specific material to cover with these new regulations, more than we have time to go over here. If your question is not answered during this presentation, there will be a Q&A section afterwards. Please don't hesitate to submit questions throughout the presentation. If it's relevant to the current topic, we might stop and answer that question at that point. Otherwise, we'll try to answer them all once we actually get to the Q&A section. Or if you are the type that likes to get your hands dirty, or if you just like to brush up on things yourself afterwards, all of this information is online in the electronic code of federal regulations at www.ecfr.gov. Specifically under Title 49, Part 380, Special Training Requirements. You can also find more information about the Training Provider Registry, which we will discuss at length at www.tpr.fmcsa.dot.gov. This presentation will focus on general ELDT information, as well as the specific information for Class A and B and H endorsement. So let's jump into things. Next slide, please. What is entry-level driver training? Beginning February 7th, 2022, entry-level drivers will be subject to the requirements in the Entry-Level Driver Training, or ELDT, regulations. The whole purpose of this is to set a minimum standard of training requirements for entry-level CDL holders. These regulations are established by the FMCSA. Next slide, please. Who does this apply to? These new regulations apply to drivers obtaining a Class A or Class B CDL for the first time, upgrading an existing Class B CDL to a Class A CDL, or obtaining a School Bus S, Passenger P, or Hazardous Materials H endorsement for the first time. Next slide, please. What about current CDL holders? The ELDT regulations are not retroactive, meaning the entry-level driver training requirements do not apply to individuals holding a valid CDL or an SP or H endorsement issued prior to February 7th, 2022. If an applicant who obtains a commercials learner permit prior to February 7th, 2022 obtains a CDL before the CLP or a renewed CLP expires, then the applicant is not subject to the ELDT requirements. This is very important. This is a question we get a lot. If you have a CDL prior to February 7th, ELDT does not apply to you. This only applies after February 7th, 2022. Next slide, please. So what's the point? The ELDT regulations establish a federal standard for training CDL applicants. Applicants must successfully complete this training before they will be permitted to take the CDL skills test, or in the case of the H endorsement, the knowledge test. This means that all new entry-level drivers should have roughly the same amount of training when they take their CDL or endorsement tests. The desire here is to prevent untrained individuals from obtaining a CDL or endorsement, and to make sure that all entry-level drivers meet the necessary basic threshold to safely operate a CMV. Next slide, please. Now that we know who is affected by the ELDT regulations, let's talk a little bit about what the training actually looks like. There is no federally mandated amount of training time that a driver trainee must complete for entry-level driver training. The FMCSA only requires that training cover all topics set forth by the FMCSA. The required topics are broken into two sections, theory and behind the wheel. Behind the wheel is broken into two further sections, range and public road. As a note, Infinit-I Workforce Solutions as a platform only handles online training, so I'll only be covering the theory portion of the training here. But if you have questions about the behind the wheel training, please do ask me. Next slide, please. Are there different requirements? The ELDT regulations are the same for Class A and B, as well as S, P, and H endorsements. There are no special regulations that must be followed for the different classes or endorsements outside of the different topics that must be covered. For clarity, what I mean by that is there's nothing that you have to do as far as ELDT regulations go to get your Class B versus getting your Class A, other than the topics that you must train on being slightly different. No class or endorsement has a hidden specific amount of time or otherwise differing requirement. There are just different topics. Depending on the class...
Jeremy, those would be supplemental. If you wanted a school bus, passenger, or hazmat endorsement, those would just be supplemental content to the standard ELDT.
Yeah, it definitely depends on where you're at in your career, right? If you're a driver that already has a CDL, right? And after February 7th, 2022, you decide you want to get your H endorsement, then you will go through the H endorsement specific entry-level driver training requirements.
Gotcha.
But then again, of course, if you're not a driver at all and you're just getting your CDL for the first time, you go through the whole program depending on what you're trying to accomplish.
Gotcha.
Mm-hmm. So depending on the class of CDL or endorsement a driver trainee is trying to obtain and the differing processes that they go through, it is feasible that a driver trainee might be trained on the same topic multiple times. For example, training on railroad crossings is required for Class A and B as well as H endorsements. So a driver might theoretically need to be trained on that topic 3 different times in a relatively rapid succession, depending on when they attempt to obtain or upgrade their CDL or endorsement. Like I was just saying with Mark's question, right? The concept that if you already have a, say, Class A CDL, and you decide you want to go for your H endorsement, then you're just going to go through that training. But if you don't have a CDL and you go for your Class A, for example, and immediately following that, you also try to get your H endorsement, you're going to have a couple of overlapping topics that you'll probably train on in rapid succession. Gotcha. So next slide, please. Remember, there is no required time amount for entry-level driver training. You just have to cover all of the topics set forth by the FMCSA for each class or endorsement. The FMCSA has established 30 training topics for Class A, 29 training topics for Class B, and 13 training topics for the hazardous materials endorsement. As I said earlier, Infinit-I Workforce Solutions is only a theory training provider, so I won't cover the behind-the-wheel topics in depth. But just as a heads up, there are 19 topics for Class A and 18 topics for Class B. There is no behind the wheel portion for H endorsement. As a note, there is no time requirement for any of the classes or endorsements. You just have to receive a minimum score of 80% on the theory assessment portion of the ELDT. And what I mean by that is throughout all of the different topics that are covered for whatever class or endorsement you are trying to achieve, you have to have an 80% minimum score on all of those topics or an overall test, depending on what your training provider provides.
So that would
Next.
be 80% for each topic, not 80% cumulative.
Yeah, it depends on what the training provider does. The way we're going to be doing it, it will be an 80% for each topic, and cumulatively that will require an 80% overall. But if your training provider does batch training in a very specific manner or something like that, you could in theory have 80% for each of the different sections or 80% as an overall. There's no standard set by the FMCSA on which is required.
I think another
It's
thing
just 80% across the board.
Gotcha.
something else that's good to address here. I know this is going to come up as a question, so I'll go ahead and head this off at the pass because we have talked about this offline. Some folks have asked us what a time expectation should be for someone to complete the topics that they're going through, and obviously that's dependent upon the content that they are using. I know with our specific content, we typically shoot for the 5 to 10 minute range. And so at a bare minimum, you can kind of do some rough math, 30 topics at worst case scenario, 10 minutes. But you also have to take into account potentially there will be people that have to go through a topic more than one time to achieve a passing score. So we're hesitant to give a recommendation on the amount of time that an individual would need to spend because everybody's going to be a little bit different depending on how quickly they learn. But for your own purposes, for scheduling and things like that, you are not looking at multiple days or weeks of training time that people are required to go through on the theory side of the material. They can get through that material as quickly as they can and knock that out in a minimum time frame, 30 topics, 10 minutes, 300 minutes, it's 5 hours. But that's not something that we can guarantee just because of the folks that may be going through the system might move at a slower rate.
Yeah, there's definitely a little bit of a range on that particular scenario. Also for clarity, right, there are 30 topics, say Class A, for example, right? There are 30 topics within Class A, but that doesn't necessarily mean that your training is only going to be 30 videos, whether you're training with us or you're training on your own time or what have you, right? Those are just the 30 topics that the FMCSA requires. So for example, I know some people are gonna be able to look at these topics. A pre-post trip, right? That's very hard to cover in just a 5-minute section, right? So what we tend to do is we try to break that down into bite-sized chunks. So you might have 3 or 4 or 5 to 10 minute videos that cover that particular topic. And that's likely what you're going to see through a lot of different training. Either you're going to see training providers either do larger videos, 20 to 30 minute videos for some of these topics. And so you'll only have 30 topics, but you'll have larger videos, or you'll have more videos within those topics covering the different range. I like to give the ballpark figure of around 10 hours, but that again is going to depend on what you're going for, right? And this is really dependent on the industry that you're in. If you're just getting your Class A, probably anywhere from 5 to 10 hours for entry-level driver training, the theory portion. Now, again, the behind-the-wheel portion adds an extra element that you're going to have to factor into that. But if you were a school bus operator, for example, right, you have to go through Class B, S, and P endorsements. And so that's an extra chunk of time that you have to actually factor into that portion of the entry-level driver training. So, all right, next slide, please. So, what are the topics? I won't read through all of these, but we will leave them on screen for a brief moment. Once again, all of this information is on the Electronic Code of Federal Regulations website at www.ecfr.gov. The sections for Class A are basic operation, safe operating procedures, advanced operating practices, vehicle systems and reporting malfunctions, and non-driving activities. Please note that if you are interested in researching this information, the FMCSA has listed each of these topics with a prompt explaining the minimum information that must be covered by the topics. That's too much information to cover in this presentation, but if you have questions about a specific topic, please let me know during the Q&A. Next slide, please. Here are the topics for Class B. Once again, I won't read through all of them, but we will leave them on the screen briefly. The eagle-eyed among you might have noticed that the Class B topics look suspiciously similar to the Class A topics. That's because they are. The only topic difference between Class A and Class B is the coupling and uncoupling topic in Section 1, being required for Class A but not being required for Class B due to obvious reasons. Next slide, please. And here are the hazardous materials endorsement topics. The vast majority of this is pretty standard stuff, and again, it is meant to be. The FMCSA's goal here isn't to reinvent the wheel, just to standardize the training that it takes to get behind one. Next slide, please. So, after all of that information, how do you get training? The short answer is to either find a training provider or to become one, but that's where things get a little bit more complicated. In order to monitor and regulate these new requirements, the FMCSA has created the Training Provider Registry. Training providers for entry-level driver training must be listed on the Training Provider Registry. Yes, that includes you if you are training your own driver trainees to obtain their CDL or an endorsement. Becoming an approved training provider requires submitting an electronic application to the Training Provider Registry, self-certifying that you meet all ELDT requirements, affirming under penalty of perjury that you will only teach the prescribed ELDT curriculum, and maintaining documentation proving ELDT compliance in the event of an audit. Once a training provider has been accepted to the TPR, they'll be assigned a unique training provider ID number, which will appear on a driver trainee's record in the Commercial Driver's License Information System. Next slide, please. So let's say you want to become a registered trainer on the TPR. In order to do that, you must meet one of the two following qualifications. One, you must hold a CDL of the same or higher class and with all endorsements necessary to operate the CMV for which training is to be provided. And you must have at least 2 years experience driving a CMV requiring a CDL of the same or higher class and or the same endorsement. And you must meet all applicable state qualification requirements for CMV instructors. Or, number 2, you must hold a CDL of the same or higher class and with all endorsements necessary to operate a CMV for which training is to be provided. And you must have at least 2 years experience as a behind-the-wheel CMV instructor and meet all applicable state qualification requirements for CMV instructors. Next slide, please. There are, of course, some exceptions to these rules. Number 1, an instructor is not required to hold a CDL of the same or higher class and with all endorsements necessary to operate the CMV for which training is to be provided if the instructor previously held a CDL of the same or higher class and still complies with the other requirements set forth in the first or second qualifications. Or number 2, training providers offering online content exclusively are not required to meet state qualification requirements for theory instructors, though it is important to note they must still meet the other requirements. Also of a note is, and this is very important if you're going to be doing your own training, of a note is that an instructor's CDL has been canceled, suspended, or revoked due to any of the disqualifying offenses identified in 383.51 of the CFR. The instructor is prohibited from engaging in theory instruction for 2 years following the date his or her CDL is reinstated. And for clarity, again, that is 2 years following the date his or her CDL is reinstated, not 2 years following the date that they lost there, that it was suspended, okay? Next slide, please. So, let's say you're a driver trainee and you go through all the required motions of ELDT. What happens after you complete your training? Once a driver trainee completes the required training for whatever they are attempting to do, they will receive a certificate that contains the following information. It'll have the date of certificate issuance on it, the name of the training provider, the mailing address of the training provider. It'll have the name of the driver trainee, a certification statement, and it'll have the printed name of the person attesting that the driver has received the required training, as well as the signature of that same person. This certificate, along with the records of completion that are sent to the training provider registry, are what allows a driver trainee to go take their CDL or endorsement test. Without this proof, a driver trainee will not be able to take their CDL or endorsement test. And really, that's it for the basics of ELDT. As far as regulations go, this one is honestly relatively benign. The vast majority of this training should be or is already being done. The entry-level driver training regulations just help standardize things, and the creation of the TPR helps organize and streamline the information and tracking process that should go into this type of training. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand this back over to Craig, who will have a couple of information points, and then we'll move into the Q&A section.
Excellent. Again, I want to remind everybody, because now that we've gone through Jeremy's presentation, you're probably going, woo, that was a lot. It is, but actually once you dig into it a little bit, it's fairly clear. A lot of the content information that Jeremy was sharing, including the H endorsement content, is content that we already have or will have shortly. I believe we are still working on some pieces of the H endorsement right now, and the very good reason for that is auditable by the DOT. So if it is not up to snuff, that puts you at risk and us at risk. So we are making sure that all of our I's are dotted and T's are crossed before that is released. But the other content, we've actually had a rough version of the ELDT library since it was initially supposed to go out years ago. So a lot of the content that you're already seeing is already available in our training catalog for those of you who are already clients of ours. For those of you who are not and would like to see how that all works, again, we have the ability to do demos with you. Actually, Woody will handle that. And I'm going to go ahead and launch a quick poll question. So if it's something that you would like after this call to have Woody reach out to you to set up a time so that you can go through that, please respond to the poll questions that are on the screen right now. And then another question that we have is we do have a sister company that we call BetterTruckDrivingJobs.com. BetterTruckDrivingJobs.com is offering everyone on the call today a free year of job postings. And obviously, we made it to front page news, everybody. The driver shortage is now on everybody's lips for all the wrong reasons. Obviously, this is a problem most of us saw coming and has been years in the works. But this visibility does mean that there are potentially eyeballs out there who are now looking at this industry as an opportunity to pursue. So we want to make that process easier for you all to do. All right, we'll go ahead and leave those up here. Now, a couple questions that we have already had come in. Going back through the chat here, and obviously if the rest of you do have questions, please leave those in chat. Mark, you have a question for Jeremy?
Yeah, I had a quick question for Jeremy. The TPR, will the training provider have a link to the state to validate this completion, or are they completely dependent on a paper certificate?
So the TPR is, by design from the FMCSA, the TPR is intended to automatically work with all state licensing agencies to sync up with their databases. So a training provider is required to provide the certificate of completion information to the TPR within 48 hours of that completion. And then the TPR will then disseminate, in theory, that information to the state licensing agencies. Alternatively, though, whenever the training provider, when the driver trainee finishes their ELDT training or entry-level driver training, they themselves will receive a certificate of completion that if they need to, they could take to their state licensing agency. And they'll have to do that, obviously, when they they take their CDL skills test.
Okay, and a TPR could be linked with several states. They're not isolated to just an individual state.
No, not that I'm aware of.
Okay, and is there a final exam for the entire portfolio of training videos?
There's no requirement for a final exam, a single final exam. That is going to be dependent on each of the different training providers. The FMCSA does not have any regulations or clarification as far as what is required there, only that there does need to be testing and that testing needs to be an 80% minimum to pass.
And the way that we're tackling that will be those subject topics broken out into individual modules or multiple modules, and then quizzes at the end of each of those modules that will be done multiple choice. And they'll know right away whether or not they have passed that quiz or if they need to retake that particular subject, and they can certainly do so within the system. They're not locked out after a certain number of attempts on a particular topic, because we know people learn differently. Some folks may need to see the information 2 or 3 times before it clicks. And we would rather have them put in the work to be able to get that passing score. We had a question here about we are going to be a registered or are already a registered training provider. Is that correct, Jeremy?
We are already on the TPR. We are just waiting for finalization to some of our different programs before we actually submit our programs, each of the individual programs, to the TPR. But we are already on the TPR, and yes, it is our intention to be on the training provider registry for Class A, Class B, S, P, and H endorsement.
And the goal there is we want it so that you all don't have to worry about maintaining a library of coursework over time. We have an entire team that does that. That's Jeremy's organization within Vertical Alliance Group. And it's a full-time job for Jeremy, because not only is it building out these courses initially, it's maintaining them over time so that they're accurate with any changes to regulations. It's not just a one and done. They are living and breathing courses that will need to be updated over time. You guys don't have the time to do that amongst all the things that you do. In a perfect world, if you did take on this as a part of internal process that you did, is that you would then be the skills training and skills test training providers. So the behind the wheel portion of the coursework that would need to happen about the actual operation of your trucks safely and the verification of that would be the piece that you would potentially own if you wanted to go down that road. So we would be the theory side, that driver skill side, behind the wheel, that would be potentially the part that you would own. So just wanted to clarify that. But we do have the ability. I know we've had some questions in the past about how could we facilitate the training easily. Some folks were worried that they'd have to set up training over and over and over again for each individual. And our system does allow you to build out templates, which is basically pre-filling training so that you just can rely on that template over and over again rather than having to go in and pick individual courses. So you could set up a template or multiple templates, and that's something that Woody could talk with you about during that demo, where all you have to do is then have the information for that new trainee and just assign out that pre-filled training that you already have set up as a convenience maker. So the goal here is we want it to function the same as those of you who are already doing safety training and other custom content through us, so that there's not a new process that you have to learn. We will have the ELDT coursework kind of warehoused separately, so it's easy to find and access, but you all could very easily set up a template. I would say, because of the number of items in the training that's required, 30 items you were probably not going to want to do all at one time. You want to break that down into more manageable chunks. We are big fans of manageable chunks because that's the best way that your brain retains information. So it's usually in the 3 to 8 minute mark is the ideal time frame for your brain to retain information it's looking at. We play to that and speak to that with our training material. We don't want to do long form videos because you're not going to remember what we talked about at the beginning of the video by the time you get done with a 45-minute training video. It's just not how our brain retains information. And the best way I can illustrate that is, you remember that TV show you watched last night? You don't remember what happened at the beginning of it by the time you got to the end of it. It's just, and that's not on you. That's just the human brain. So Let's see here. We already have any other questions that are coming in here. Let me make sure we're getting all of those. Keep them coming, folks. These are good
One other
discussions.
question for
Sure.
Jeremy. As this matures, as this mandate matures and changes over time, I would assume Jeremy and his team will keep the subscribers current on all those changes.
Absolutely. It is a part of our process to continually maintain and update any of our information as regulations change. So if next year the FMCSA decides to add a couple topics to the ELDT requirements, we will update and add those, and they'll just be a part of the typical program.
And is there a renewal? Does this need to be renewed after the initial completion?
No, this is a one and done type scenario. So once a driver trainee goes through their entry-level driver training and acquires their CDL, they're not going to have to do anything to renew that. The only thing is if they were then to either upgrade that CDL or try to acquire a new endorsement, then they would have to go through the entry-level driver training for that particular thing. So.
Gotcha.
Now, Chad has a great question for us. Are they going to push this back like they've already done before and have done for other requirements? I'll let you take this one, Jeremy.
Unfortunately, we cannot answer that question. That is the FMCSA's purview. I will say this, though, with the conversations that I have had with various officials and individuals from the FMCSA and from other associations, most, if not all, of the people involved in this are adamant about making this happen. It's already been pushed back before. The people involved seem to be very serious about this deadline and making it happen this time around. However, we've seen that in the past with the FMCSA, so we're going to be ready for it whether or not they push it back.
But we do understand the hesitance you guys have. Chad had talked about how some states don't have the ability to do their part of the technology side of things, which we completely understand. Trust us, we work with those same organizations from time to time and those same challenges, and we are moving faster than a lot of the state governments are when it comes to technology. So, but that, unfortunately, we are moving forward with the hopes that it will be realized. But again, it's not something that we can guarantee. They could come out tomorrow and tell us they've pushed the requirement back again, and then there we are. So,
absolutely.
But fingers crossed, this time is the time. So a couple of the questions here. If a driver completes the Class A ELDT requirements, can they still legally drive a Class B, or do they need to complete the Class B also?
Oh, no, absolutely, right. The same scenario applies as our typical situation. A Class A is still superior to a Class B. It's more rigorous training. There's more requirements that go into it, quote unquote, right? A Class A allows you to drive any CDL or any CMV below that class. So once you achieve your Class A, you're good as far as that goes. The only thing that changes from there is whether or not you need an endorsement for whatever else it is you're going to be doing, right? So obviously driving a motor coach or something like that, you would need a passenger endorsement for that particular vehicle. If you wanted to drive a school bus, you need both the passenger and S endorsement, the school bus endorsement, or if you want to go into hazmat, you'll need an H endorsement. But Class A, as far as the FMCSA has made the industry aware, Class A still trumps Class B. So,
Gotcha. We have a question here. How does this impact employer-required entry-level driver training? And I guess that's
a good question. I think this also kind of combines into another question that we have. As a company, do we still need to provide the current ELDT training required to drive, considering we have a gap here where we're at right now with February 7th, 2022. So here's the deal. Everything that you're required to do right now, you are still required to do up until February 7th, 2022. After February 7th, 2022, These entry-level driver training requirements replace the current entry-level driver training requirements, with a couple of caveats, right? And this is how the FMCSA kind of works. So we know how this functions. You need to be on your game with this. There are certain things that you as an employer are going to have to continue doing, right? Like you will still need to do a drive test. You'll still need to do a test for each of your new drivers to say, yep, we tested them in a vehicle. They look good. We put their information in a file. We're good to go. But as far as entry-level driver training goes, these requirements are replacing the current ones.
Okay. We had a question here from Gabe. As a company, do we still need to provide the current ELDT training required for drivers with less than a year experience until February 2022? Answer is yes, given what Jeremy just shared with us. And then
until February 7th.
Yep. And that's when it will change. So if you do have people in your pipeline, now is the time to get them squared away. So
yeah, and I mean, as a safety training provider, I hesitate to say this, right? But if you obviously we're all going to need to become accustomed to this in the next year, right? This is the way things are going to be as we move forward. But if you've got some people that you need to take care of them now. It's going to be a simpler process for you to go through at this current point in time. Might as well get it done with.
Absolutely. And then let's see here. With the scenario of recruiting a Class A holder, so it's an existing Class A driver, has no H endorsement, all that will be needed for that H endorsement is to go through the theory training, which Infinit-I will offer. Is that accurate?
Absolutely. There is no behind the wheel portion for hazardous materials endorsements, which means that you just need to go through the theory training and then go take your knowledge test and you're good to go.
Excellent. And that's a great question on here about documentation. We do document everything that happens in our system. Our system is online for that reason. And regardless of device, regardless of whether they are using a web browser or one of the app versions of our platform, we record it all because we want to make it trackable over time so that you can go back and review it should you need to. Because if you do decide to become a registered training provider, there is an opportunity there that you could be audited for your training records. And Jeremy and I had talked about this offline, that there would be a record keeping requirement for you as a training provider of 3 years that you would have to hold on to the training documentation. And the good news is we hold on to all of our training documentation indefinitely. We still have the first piece of training that we ever recorded back in 2010 when we started doing this for the very first time. We still have that should that company ever need to access it. So we warehouse all of that because we understand you need to have access to that information because it will be something that the government may want to look at. Mark and I, we have talked a little bit about, from a litigation perspective, this is absolutely something that plaintiff lawyers are looking at opportunities where they can exploit this information. So we want to make sure that you're buttoned up and that you've got all your I's dotted and T's crossed. So excellent. Absolutely. Lots of great questions, everyone. Thank you so much for those. We appreciate that.
Looks like we've got another one. Will your H endorsement training cover the requirements or will I need to cover other material? So this is, I'm going to answer this in two parts for clarity to make sure that everyone gets exactly what they're needed. So we as a training provider already have hazardous materials training content on our platform. That training does not cover the entirety of the entry-level driver training requirements. We are in the process of updating that training and refining that training to cover a broader scope that is required by the FMCSA for ELDT. And that training will cover everything that you need for entry-level driver training. So once we finish that and we push that live, then that will cover everything, yes.
And then when it comes time for the renewal on their hazmat, would they be going through the same material over again?
It won't be the exact same material, no. There will be slight differences comparatively to the entry-level driver training. The requirements that the FMCSA has for entry-level driver training for H endorsement are not the exact same for just your renewal. So there's slight deviations there. Basically, a couple of little additional base pieces of information that the FMCSA wants people to train on for the hazardous materials endorsement rather than the renewal. Entry-level driver stuff, basically.
Gotcha. Excellent. Now, a question from Phyllis. We are looking to hire a lower experienced, or looking at a lower experience requirement down to 6 months. If the driver currently has Class A CDL, do they need to do the ELDT training if hired? The answer there would only be if they were adding an endorsement, if they're adding that hazmat endorsement. So
if they've already got their Class A, any driver who has a CDL right now, they are good to go come February 7th, as long as that is still a valid CDL, right? If they have a valid CDL come February 7th, they're good to go. Or even if they have, if you get someone their commercials learner's permit, then they're still good to go as long as they get their CDL after that, before that CLP doesn't renew, basically.
I would comment to Phyllis, I think it would be a good practice to do it, though. Not a requirement, but a very good, solid practice.
Absolutely. As a training provider or a person who creates training, right, I'm always going to suggest, yeah, if you have the opportunity, do the ELDT stuff. It's going to teach your drivers good information. It's going to teach them good habits. It's worth it. Get in the habit of doing it. It honestly doesn't take that long. Rinse, repeat.
No, it's a great way to reinforce good behaviors. We know that in some cases, revisiting this information more than one time with an experienced driver, yes, it's things they have been taught before, perhaps even multiple times, but you don't realize how many times the silly things that we take for granted when it comes to safety, like seat belts, are contributing to fatality accidents involving tractor drivers on the road. So it's worth revisiting that. Obviously, putting together maybe a little bit more palatable format as part of an orientation, just to make sure that those folks are getting a touch on that. Some of you may have questions that you just aren't comfortable asking online. I completely understand that. So Jeremy's contact information is below here. Feel free to shoot him an email. There are still a couple things that we're sussing out on our end when it comes to entry-level driver training. We're still working on our certificate formatting, for example, which is why we did not have an example of what that looks like to show you today. But when we do, we will be sharing that information. And we're also working on some different things when it comes to scoring and so forth to establish some rules. Right now, our platform gives companies the option of allowing an individual student the ability to see questions that they missed before they retake a section of their training. And we're working on the compliance of where we need to be on that, whether we need to be allowing people to see those answers or potentially not allowing them to see those answers, so that when they're getting a good score, they're paying closer attention to the training material and that 80% is legitimately earned. Let's see, would you suggest a company have a trainer on staff even though we only hire current Class A drivers?
That's a great question, actually. Yeah. I really want to jump in. I've been eyeing this question while you were talking, Craig. I really like this question. So from a regulatory standpoint, you have no requirement to do that. From a safety culture standpoint, I would say absolutely have a trainer or, a safety person. Obviously, most of the companies are going to have a safety training individual. But if you don't have a specific person who wears that hat in your company, get that person, right? Safety culture is a massive thing. The companies that are the safest out there on the road, that have the lowest insurance premiums, that have the least accidents, that have the CSA scores to back that up, they're the ones that have a safety culture and the people to push that safety culture forward. So no, there's no regulatory requirement for you to have a trainer if you're just hiring people that already have all of the CDL requirements or endorsements that you need. But I'd still have someone there to go through this material and other material, obviously.
Excellent. Let's check that other way here. See, we are moving away from hiring inexperienced drivers. However, out of curiosity, how long will a commercial learner's permit last until it becomes null and void and someone must reapply? What's the typical expiration on that learner's permit?
Mark, you might need to field
Yeah, I think in the state of
this
Texas,
one for me.
I think it's 90 days in the state of Texas.
Yeah.
I think it changes from state to state.
State to state. And then there's also, I believe, most states allow you to renew that CLP as long as you're still within that time limit. You can renew it for an additional length of time. So, and again, as long as you have a CLP or a renewed CLP and you get your CDL before that CLP expires, before in this February 7th, 2022 range, right, you still don't have to worry about the ELDT requirements.
Excellent. All right, for everyone on the call today that joined us, we are going to be sending out a replay of today's video. We're going to be sending out a copy of the presentation as well, so you can share those within your organization with anyone else that needs that information, or go back and reference it yourselves. We're also going to provide you a link to a great document the FMCSA has put together, which is kind of a how to become a registered training provider. So those of you that want to take this step can follow those steps that the FMCSA outlines so that you can make that happen for your organization. But otherwise, thank you all so much for joining us today. We appreciate your time. We hope you got a lot out of it. We did cover a lot of ground here with Jeremy. And Jeremy, thank you for being here with us. Mark, it's always a pleasure. Woody,
Absolutely.
we appreciate you. And everyone else out there in TV land, we look forward to seeing you again real soon, and be safe out there, everyone. Thank you.